So, moments of hiding and revealing, Central Asia as spectacle. With the popularization of photography, the medium's role in visual, cultural, and natural history followed new directions that reflected the ways in which imperial and colonial science were being transformed. Ranging from scientific studies to naturalist portraits, photography became a focus for various intellectual and cross-cultural encounters, and thus presented not only an extraordinary new visual technology, but also introduced a new means of discourse between individuals, museums, and politicians in different parts of the Russian Empire, and indeed across the globe. The alternation between imperial and colonial structures, visual culture, and natural sciences, this research examines the intricacies of these relationships and offers a new perspective on photography's indispensable but complex role in Russian imperial history and the formation of the 19th century museum. The comparative analysis that frames this study highlights the way naturalism in the Russian colonial era used the merging medium of photography alongside, but gradually also in place of, other forms of visual culture to enhance imperial and global networks, support investigations, advance careers, promote natural history and first colonial museums in novel ways for a new generation of consumers or audiences. Perceiving nationalism through photography, asks these various visual arguments about a shared classical national past that came to be challenged or revised through modernism. This contribution considers how photography has governed the field of Central Asian culture, shaping how its artifacts and images were collected, displayed, and circulated in exhibits. Okay, so Asia has always been the great counterweight to Europe, a world of mighty empires and prosperous societies, glorious cultural achievements, and venerable religions. This is a quote from Jürgen Osterhammer in Unfabling the East. Central Asian studies referred to a broader and more historical view of the region's scholarly study. It also refers to the larger Orientalism, which was falling on Russia in the 19th century. In contesting the preeminence of the Russian domination in Central Asia, Russia's 19th century eminent historian, professor of St. Petersburg University, Fyodor Martins, notes that, quote, the wild tribes must ripen before joining the family of the civilized people, end quote. Such argumentation flourished at the time of the Russian conquest of Turkestan, serving as convention for explaining the necessity to remove the veneer of civility and honoring the palm of the Enlightenment to the unenlightened people. The Russian perception of domination acknowledged the stereotypes of le mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, erasing the nuances between ethnic groups, proclaiming the Slavic race to be supreme and damping the Orient as secondary. In one of his reports of the 1860s, military historian Mikhail Vinyukov openly proclaims the supremacy of the Russian nation, calling for the sacrifice of national stride of the races of lower development for the interests of majority of the civilized mankind. The capture of Tashkent in 1865 by General Mikhail Chernyayev roused the Emir of Bukhara, who in turn declared a holy war against the infidel, and hostilities now spread over the greater part of Central Asia. The political and administrative history of the conquest remains outside the scope of this paper. Suffice it to say that the emir was beaten in his turn and lost his main fortress of Khojent, and in 1866, Turkestan became a Russian governor-generalship, and an extremely able and ambitious administrator, Konstantin von Kaufmann, was appointed first governor-general, with such extended powers as to make him virtually independent of the central government. Bukhara not having paid the indemnity imposed after the War of 1866, von Kaufmann renewed hostilities and captured Samarkand. Many of those present at this conference will recall and imagine the sequence of events from the famous paintings of Russian realist artist Vasily Vereshchagin, such as the defense of Samarkand fortress of 1868. By the Treaty of 1868, all these acquisitions were confirmed, and both Bukhara and Khokhand came under a Russian protectorate. Khiva remained the only remote outpost uncaptured by the Russians. In the midst of its sandy desert, the place was 500 miles away from the Caspian coast, 600 miles from Tashkent, and 930 miles from Orenburg, which necessarily would form the base for any large-scale operation. The advanced Russian posts in the desert could only serve as jumping-off places for the final attack, but not as an actual base camp. It was this distance from its supplies and reserves which, in the face of climactic and natural difficulties, made the task so formidable for any attacking force, taxing human endurance to the utmost. This concise history of the beginning of Russia's rule in Central Asia can explain the geographical parameters of von Kaufmann's formidable product, the Turkestan album of 1871 to 72. I think there it is. And the reasons why this outstanding production focused mainly on the regions of Tashkent, Samarkand, and Zarafshansk, but excluded Khiva, Merv, Geoktepe, and the territories from Tashkent to Andijan in the proximity of the Chinese border. The same human endurance has been asked from the team of the album's photographers, linguists, and researchers who worked under the bellicose executive orders and aggressive intimidation. Russia's rapid advance across Central Asia was being carefully and anxiously watched from England. On the other hand, the Russians had been busy studying the English examples of imperial and colonial photography, the Indian Amateurs Photographic Album of 1856 to 58, the People of India, photographic views and panoramas taken by Signor Felice Beato during the Indian Mutiny in 1857 to 58, and the late war in China of 1860, and an illustrated historical album of the Rajas and Talukdars of Oud, and many more. Russian photographers working on the Turkestan album were seeking support in John Thompson's venerable words that, quote, photography is absolutely trustworthy. Thompson was a photographic instructor at the Royal Geographical Society who believed, like von Kaufmann, that photographs provided reliable evidence once they were placed at the service of other forms of colonial ideology. Von Kaufmann was keen to discover or produce the Russian John Murrays and Philip Henry Edgingtons who toured India, making topographical views during the production of his album. Oopsies. I'm not entirely sure which of these. In antiquities, I believe. No, that's not antiquities. Sorry, I'm just checking on the images. No, okay. Photographic teams for the album brought together emerging practices and new techniques. Trained in Russia, but often in the European context and according to European methods, some of them practiced photography at home and abroad, others excelled in situ. The complex images produced by these practitioners who tried to negotiate in the tight zone of, quote, cultural confrontation, negotiation, and brokerage, and, quote, according to the photographic historian Elizabeth Edwards, reflects the dynamics of Russian colonial encounters with the local population. What motivated these photographers in Central Asia? How did they approach the picturing of their subjects that were so different from their own patterns of identification? In what ways might their work complicate what we know about photography as an especially potent purveyor of cultural ideology? How did their descriptions of non-Slavic subjects and cultures, to borrow the terminology of Ijaz Ahmad, challenge and reinforce the colonial imagination and the colonial legacies in Russia. In considering such questions, this presentation will extend the history of Russian photographic domination in Central Asia in order to illuminate its role in shaping discourses on race, ethnicity, and cultural difference. The first impressions of Central Asia produced by Russian photographers is of the sheer size of the Islamic world in its original form, and of the extraordinary degree of mutual visibility that existed between its various regions. But what were the themes that echoed and passed with greatest frequency and insistency from one end of this vast region to the other, from the Caspian Sea to Kashgar? The first, of course, is the omnipresence of the Quran. What needs a leap of the imagination to enter into it is the manner in which the omnipresence of the Quran, or citations from the Quran on objects of every kind, was based on a sense of the peculiar omnipresence of God in Muslim thought and piety. This is a God who is always present everywhere. There is no special place reserved for him where he might be more present than anywhere else. No body and blood of God in the Eucharist, no haunting presence of Christ and the Virgin in icons and the familiar sacral paraphernalia to the Russians. Even the cult of saints, which was widespread amongst Orthodox culture in all areas, never held the same unchallenged high grounds as it did in Muslim Central Asia. Every step the Russian photographers took was carefully watched by the locals. Their activities were not limited to photography alone, but also embraced cultural, educational, and scientific problems. Though the actual work was done mostly by Russian scientists, merchants, and missionaries, it was photographers galvanizing energy and their spirit which were responsible for vast and successful photographic projects. They were tremendously interested in the geographical research undertaken by Russian scientists and explorers in the Semirichia and Zarafshan to measure existing architectural monuments and structures like kurgans, the sacred burial sites resembling fortresses or high graves. And I have a strange feeling that that's what that is. Volunteers were called for amongst the technical and military officers and the architectural and archaeological expeditions left for Samarkand and Kokand. Viewed from the Russian side, both religious zones, a Christian Byzantium of which Russia was an offshoot, and the adjusted Muslim territories seem, despite their differences, to have much in common. Both were zones of flat art, of miniatures and icons. Anyone who came from a prolonged stay in Central Asia was liable to be shocked for a moment by the heavy, seemingly bulbous kurgans positioned amidst the steppes and the deserts, resembling the local flora that proliferated in medieval Central Asia. What for us is a sign of realism and a welcome bridge toward human contact with divine and holy figures would have struck the first Russian photographers in Central Asia quite as somehow overdone. Such art lacked the reticence and the sense of transcendentance conveyed by quiet surfaces where the eye itself has to work. We need to remind ourselves that the builders of the ancient kurgans were near contemporary of the pagans and Scythians and their celibate followers. By contrast, what the album's team were asked to capture, and this is photographer Nikharoshev and several anonymous photographers, Russian Orientalist and naturalist Alexei Hun, compilers and historians M. Terentiev, M. Bradovsky, and M. Bagaevsky. So they were asked to capture the huge necropolis of Gur-Aymir Mausoleum, Zai-Zinda of Samarkand. So this is here, and then the Vereshchagin. These are 14th century mausolea. They were as much a product of a world of the Timurid Empire of the 1370 to 1467 for presentation to the eyes of the Russian court, who were the audience of sophisticated luxury and manners. What we have to understand is the almost numinous authority that such art conveyed. It eventually reached far down the social scale in the remarkable process of democratization, so as to bring a touch of royalty to merchants, townsmen and artisans who died off golden lustreware and burnished tin rather than from the gold and silver of ancient rulers. This was an art of luxury that crossed all frontiers. The 19th century Russian Empire constantly benefited from it, from the Central Asian silks and ceramics, robustly crafted tiles in Samarkand, and delicately embroidered robes and fabrics of Katand, a high point in the Central Asian history of wearing that has never been equaled since. With these challenges, the album project transformed photography into a tool for reflecting, absorbing, and assembling life in Central Asia. It converted foreign lands and people into a gallery documenting every stage of history, from triumphs and victories to failures and capitulations. No one doubted its capacity for representational objectivity. It was photography's most important attribute. The other attribute was its humanity. The only local photographer from Tashkent who worked on the first three parts of the album, two archaeological parts and the ethnographical part, was N. Nikharoshev, who tried to capture and preserve the sitters' humanities, never trying to attempt to rob them of it. For that reason, it seems appropriate to include in a quotation from the most recent publication of the Peabody Museum about the lasting legacy of Joseph T. Zeeley's daguerreotypes of enslaved men and women who entered his studio in Columbia, South Carolina in March in the 1850s. Quote, "Those who tried to steal their humanity, for they are also dust. But those who celebrated it," he said, "still seem as live to us as they were on that day." End quote. When, though confronted and brought before the camera, quote, "they stood there with pride in who they knew they were," end quote. Photography had no iconographic vocabulary to match that of painting. It posited a new kind of description of events in order to perceive that kind of description of a particular social appeal to the nobility and the rising middle class. The avenues that Russian photographers explored in Central Asia through their realistic vocabulary was at times charged with social significance, commenting on social setting and trying to reduce it to the Russian understanding with little success. The nature and function of photographic realism in Central Asia is one of the most startlingly realistic as well as psychologically penetrating works of its time. It runs the narrative of realistic observation charged with personal, artistic, special and psychological meanings, not to mention racial curiosity and ethnographic differences. So there's just a couple more here. As you can see, the different types of people of the Turkestan region. Nikharoshev is one of the rare examples of local photographic practices. His choice of scenes is typical of his times. He chose local rituals, festivities, festivities, domestic choruses and interactions with each other that were very common photography, since they announced moments of introduction to a new kind of population. The realism of Nikharoshev's photographs defies easy analysis or categorization, for his uncertainties soon become apparent. His work is personal as well. As a local photographer who observed life around him in Tashkent, his curiosity, foresight, and persistence paid off, coinciding with the revolutionary times in photography, although he did not know it. Although the intrigue of Nikharoshev's photographs for the album cannot likely be passed off as an illustration of his daily observations, his artistic and personal self-consciousness is exhibited here. The album's ethnographic part contains a remarkable aberration in the photographer's realistic vocabulary. The elderly kneels informed, their younger siblings and village fellows sit behind them. In the background, their possessions loom. Nope. Okay. Suddenly, Nikharoshev introduces into his photography a hierarchical order, a humanistic scale, still found in the early periods of colonial photography, but not yet seen in Russian photographic albums. In his realism, deceptive, inconsistent, or accepting the conventions of the class and age hierarchical system in search of not an ideal, but many realities. Later, voluntarily or perhaps involuntarily, he gave up realist photography in favor of landscapes and panoramas, as if removing himself from the adverse effect of colonial photography. The Russian photographers in Central Asia achieved only very limited success by using photographic processes and salted paper prints, despite their widespread adoption in the West. Photography in the hands of Russian officers, scientists, and artist-turned-photographers was considered one of the 7 items in the standard paraphernalia of civilization and enlightenment, along with newspapers, the postal system, gas lights, steam engines, exhibitions, and dirigibles. It was linked not merely to some vague way to the notion of becoming more civilized, it was firmly and explicitly connected to the process of industrialization and the building of a modern Turkestan. Some Central Asian nobilities became important consumers of photographic services starting in the early 1880s, sponsoring a variety of large-scale photographic projects. Von Kaufmann demonstrated considerable cunning when it came to publicizing his album, and Central Asia as his magisterial project. He revealed his research obliquely in a cumulative fashion, adopting the tactics of the colonial propaganda with its hybrid of editorial means and promotional ends. Von Kaufmann devised a winning scheme for exposing a large-scale photographic project. He realized tempting bits of information that would be relayed to the public by imperial speakers and the military higher echelons at the General Staff. Although he kept the working process secret until the whole project was nearing completion, all 6 volumes were in preparation simultaneously as he set up several teams under the supervision of different leaders. He managed to inspire both speculative talk and convincing accounts about his ambitious undertaking. He was hoping to present the album at the opening of the Polytechnical exhibition in Moscow, in 1872, but missed it by weeks. The official program of the exhibition aimed to present the cultural and technological life of the Russian Empire of the present day, as well as the totality of the industrial and economic status, and to further the progress of both. Since this particular exhibition was dominated by projects of innovation and modernity, one was left with an impression that the expectations of photography as a rapidly developing industry worldwide, of the equitable representation of all Russian nations, fell somewhat short of these high ideals. Von Kaufmann sought the chance to fulfill the gap, but even his impeccable strategic calculations failed. A number of journalists and collectors expressed appreciation for the album. Reviewers applauded it after the emperor had received his honorary copy. Von Kaufmann was under considerable financial strain during and after production of the album. However, he was extremely well connected with St. Petersburg political and military elite, artists and members of the technical department of the General Staff. It is tempting to see in von Kaufmann's methods of professional showmaker who make spectators believe what they are witnessing. His logic and skills as an ideologist and advertiser exploit the gap between visiting and narrating, telling and observing. Though many now anonymous and unimportant reviewers made attempts to parody and belittle von Kaufmann's apparent talents for colonial posturing and photographic promotion, others were quick to express these strategies as essential for a governor of a young colony in progress, modernizing and reinventing itself. The Turkestan album is both the first viable photographic self-portrait of Russia's Central Asia and the first fabricated assemblage of illustrations of conventional naturalism of the territory. More explicitly, von Kaufmann understood photography as a performative tool, as a technology of the self, an active terrain of possibility, narration, and strategic positioning of human resources, political events, and historical flow. It is a sociological field and a marketplace, simultaneously silenced and voiced by the photographic in the most declarative, theatrical, and convincing manner. Thank you.